Hi guys, this is Silver the Hedgehog, and today I will be reading you all Chapter 7, Calvin, from Sideway Stories from Wayside School, written by Louis Sachar. Now this chapter is something I can relate to because nothing makes too much sense because my future is pretty much in ruins, but the present seemed to be okay. But, I don't know. Well, without further delay, everyone, let's get reading. Calvin had a big round face. Calvin, said Mrs. Jules, I want you to take this note to Miss Zarbs for me. Miss Zarbs? Asked Calvin. Yes, Miss Zarbs, said Mrs. Jules. You know where she is, don't you? Yes, said Calvin. She's on the 19th story. Yes, said Calvin. She's on the 19th story. I don't know if I said that already, but still. That's right, Calvin, said Miss Jules. Take it to her. Calvin didn't move. Well, what are you waiting for? Asked Mrs. Jules. She's on the 19th story, said Calvin. Yes, we've already established that fact, said Mrs. Jules. The 19th story, Calvin repeated. Yes, Calvin, the 19th story, said Mrs. Jules. Now take it to her before I lose my patience. But Miss Jules, said Calvin. Now, Calvin, said Mrs. Jules, unless you'd rather go home on the kindergarten bus. Yes, ma'am, said Calvin. Slowly he walked out of the room. Ha ha ha, laughed Terence. Take it to the 19th story. Give it to Miss Zarbs, hooted Myron. Have fun on the 19th story, called Jason. Calvin stood outside the door to the classroom. He didn't know where to go. As you may know, when the builder built Wayside School, he accidentally built it sideways. But he also forgot to build the 19th story. He built the 18th and the 20th, but no 19th. He said it was very sorry. There was also no Miss Zarbs. Miss Zarbs taught the class on the 19th story. Since there was no 19th story, there was no Miss Zarbs. And besides that, as if Calvin didn't have enough problems, there was no note. Mrs. Jules had never given Calvin the note. Boy, this is just great, thought Calvin. Just great. I'm supposed to take a note that I don't have to a teacher who doesn't exist and who teaches on the story that was never built. He didn't know what to do. He walked down the 18th story, then back up to the 20th, then back down to the 18th, and back up again to the 20th. There was no 19th story. There was never a 19th story. There never will be a 19th story. Calvin walked down to the administration office. He decided to put the note in Miss Zarbs' mailbox. But there wasn't one of those either. That didn't bother Calvin too much. However, since he didn't have a note, he looked out the window and saw Louis, the art teacher, shooting baskets. Louis will know what to do, he thought. Calvin went outside. Hey, Louis, Calvin called. Hi, Calvin, said Louis. He tossed him the basketball. Calvin dribbled up and took a shot. He missed. Louis tipped it in. Do you want to play a game? Louis asked. I don't have time, said Calvin. I have to deliver a note to Miss Zarbs up on the 19th story. Then what are you doing all the way down here? Louis asked. There's no 19th story, said Calvin. Then where's Miss Zarbs? Asked Louis. There is no Miss Zarbs, said Calvin. What are you gonna do with the note? Asked Louis. There is no note, said Calvin. I understand, said Louis. That's good, said Calvin, because I sure don't. It's very simple, said Louis. You're not supposed to take no notes to no teachers. You already haven't done it. Calvin still didn't understand. I'll just have to tell Miss Jules that I couldn't deliver the note, he said. That's good, said Louis. The truth is always the best. Besides, I don't think I understand what I said either. Calvin walked back up the 30 flights of stairs to Mrs. Jules' class. Thank you very much, Calvin, said Mrs. Jules. Calvin said, but Mrs. Jules interrupted him. That was a very important note, and I'm glad that I was able to count on you. Yes, but you see, said Calvin, you delivered the note to Mrs. Darmston on the 19th story, asked Jason. How did you do it? What do you mean, how did he do it? Asked Mrs. Jules. He gave Miss Zarves the note. Some people, Jason, are responsible. But you see, Mrs. Jules, said Calvin, the note was very important, said Mrs. Jules. I told Miss Zarves not to meet me for lunch. Don't worry, said Calvin. She won't. Good, said Mrs. Jules. I have a coffee can full of Tootsie Roll Pops on my desk. You may help yourself to one, for being such a good messenger. Thanks, said Calvin, but really, it was nothing. And that was Chapter 7, Calvin, from Sideway Stories from Wayside School, written by Louis Sachar. What do I think of it? To be perfectly honest, I actually find this chapter really enjoyable. True, Calvin didn't really have to do anything, but that's basically the part of the chapter. It is very confusing, but it actually makes sense if you look deeper into the chapter. Like, Miss Zarves doesn't exist, then the 19th story doesn't exist. And there's no note, so apparently, I guess that kind of makes sense. Now I don't know what I'm saying anymore. But anyway, what do you guys think of this chapter? Did you like it or did you not? And what do you think of this story so far? Did you enjoy it or are you not enjoying it? Feel free to let me know in the comment section down below. Well, I better get going. I have a dinner date with my darling Blaze the cat. But thank you all very much for watching. This is Silver the Hedgehog signing off. See ya!